Plot Summary 59, MiddleMarch. Introduction. MiddleMarch by George Eliot was first published in one-volume edition in 1874. Before that, the novel had appeared in serial form from 1871 to 1872. The subtitle of MiddleMarch is a study of provincial life. George Eliot was the pen name of Mary Ann Evans. It was the seventh novel written by her. She started writing it in 1869, but she put it aside during the final illness of Thornton Lewes, the son of her companion George Henry Lewes. She resumed writing the novel in 1970. She started fusing together many stories into a coherent novel. When MiddleMarch was first published, it received great response and attracted large sales. MiddleMarch is set in a fictitious Midlands town of MiddleMarch. It is said that the town is based on Coventry. The time period is between 1830 and 1832. There are several plots with a number of characters. There are interlocking narratives in the novel. The story pursues a number of underlying themes. Some of the most significant themes of the novel are the nature of marriage, the status of women, idealism and self-interest, religion and hypocrisy, education, and political reform. The tone of the novel is mildly didactic, though the pace of the story is leisurely. There is an authorial voice which seems to be occasionally bursting through the narrative. The canvas of the story is quite broad. There are a few comical and comically named characters such as Mr. Brooke, the Chinee and Miss Noble, and Mrs. Dollop in the novel, but MiddleMarch is definitely a work of realism. Several issues of the time are voiced through several characters in the novel. The issues of the time were the Great Reform Bill, the beginnings of the railways, the death of King George IV and the succession of his brother, the Duke of Clarence. The state of the contemporary medical science is also brought to the knowledge of the readers through the story. The entire novel is divided into 8 books. The 8 books are not autonomous entities, but they reflect the form of the original serialization. There is a short prelude which gives the idea of the latter-day Saint Teresa. MiddleMarch has continued to maintain its popularity and status as one of the masterpieces of English fiction, though some of the critics seem to be dissatisfied. Plot Summary. In the opening of the novel, we are introduced to Dorothy Brooke. She happens to be an idealistic and well-off young woman. She is quite generous and helpful, involved in several schemes to help the lot of the local poor. Dorothy is supposed to marry the rich landowner, Sir James Chatham, a neighbor, but her sister Celia is not happy with it. She is dismayed by the prospect of Dorothy marrying James Chatham. However, later Celia marries Chatham. Mr. Brooke, Dorothy's uncle, is also not happy. Dorothy decides to marry Edward Casaubon, a scholar. Edward is a middle-aged pedantic character. Dorothy believes that Edward is engaged in a great work, doing his research and writing his book The Key to All Mythologies. She wants to share her husband's intellectual life to achieve fulfillment in her life, but during their honeymoon in Rome, Dorothy feels that he is not much interested in her ambitions. She senses his coldness. She, with the progression of time, begins to understand that his project is not going to be successful. She begins to pity him. Will Ladislaw happens to be Casaubon's young cousin. Dorothy forms a warm friendship with Will. However, She realizes that her husband is quite apathetic towards Will. Her husband begins to believe that Will Ladislaw is trying to seduce Dorothea to gain access to Casaubon's fortune. As a result, Casaubon forbids Will's visits to the estate. Casaubon falls ill, and in his poor health he talks with Dorothea. He tries to extract from her a promise that should he die, she would avoid doing what he should deprecate and apply herself to do what he desired. He means to say that she should shun Will Ladislaw. Dorothea believes that she will be able to complete his project, the key to all mythologies, in his place. Dorothea wants to reply, but before she can answer to her husband, he dies. After his death, it transpires that Casaubon has added the extraordinary provision to his will that if Dorothea married Will Ladislaw, she would not be entitled to inherit Casaubon's fortune. On the other hand, Tertius Lydgate, a young doctor, arrives in MiddleMarch. He is an idealistic young doctor who possesses advanced ideas for medical reform. He begins to work as a volunteer in the hospital. He comes into contact with Mr. Bulstrode, the town's financier. Mr. Bulstrode happens to have philanthropic learning. It transpires that Bulstrode is also a religious zealot with a secret past. Rosamond Vincy happens to be Bulstrode's niece. She is the daughter of the mayor. She is a recognized beauty in town. She sees Lydgate and sets her eyes on him. She is attracted to his aristocratic connections and his novelty. With the passage of time, Rosamond wins the heart of the young doctor. They get married, but she is very much self-centered and he is quite idealist. It turns out to be an unhappy marriage. Lydgate is not able to maintain his financial affairs properly, and consequently he finds himself deep in debt. He seeks help from Bulstrode. Camden's far brother is the local preacher. Lydgate is his friend. Camden supports him emotionally. Camden is a very generous parson. It transpires Fred, Rosamond's brother, is university educated. He is restless and irresponsible. He happens to be reluctantly destined for the church. It is disclosed that Fred has been in love with his childhood sweetheart, Mary Garth. She happens to be a very sensible and forthright young woman. She declares that she is not going to marry him until he abandons the church. She knows that Fred is not interested in the church. She wants him to settle in a more suitable career. Though she does not intend to do it, because of her Fred loses a considerable fortune. It was bequeathed to Fred by the aged and irascible Mr. Featherstone, but it was rescinded by a later will which Mr. Featherstone had drawn. On his deathbed he requests Mary to destroy that will which gives money to Fred. Mary does not follow Mr. Featherstone's request. On the other hand, Fred takes a loan for his horse dealing. The loan is co-signed by Mary's father. Fred falls into trouble over that injudicious horse dealing. Caleb Garth, Mary's father, is compelled to pay the loan because Fred fails to pay it back. Fred is quite humiliated and he is completely shocked, but Caleb is forgiving. He takes Fred under his wing and trains him as a land agent. There are several side plots in the novel. Mr. Brooke happens to be a humorous character. He tries to enter Parliament as a sponsor of reform. Suddenly, there is a twist in the story with the arrival of John Raffles. He knows about Bulstrode's past. He decides to blackmail Bulstrode. It transpires that in his youth, Bulstrode was engaged in some questionable financial dealings and he owes much of his early fortune to a marriage to a much older, wealthy widow. Bulstrode is frightened by that fact that John Raffles might disclose his secret. Raffles happens to be quite sick and alcohol is forbidden to him. Bulstrode gives him alcohol and excessive amounts of opium to hasten his death. However, Bulstrode is too late because Raffles has already spread out the word. Lydgate is shocked by Bulstrode's disgrace. The knowledge of the loan to the doctor becomes public. People begin to say that he happens to be complicit with Bulstrode. For all that, Dorothea and Fairbrother continue to maintain their faith in Lydgate, but Lydgate and Rosamond are threatened by the general opprobrium and they are compelled to leave MiddleMarch. Bulstrode faces exile too, but his wife stands by him and it is his only consolation. The final complexity of the plot lies in the story of Ladislaw. He continues to maintain his love for Dorothea. He continues to live in MiddleMarch, working as a newspaper editor for Mr. Brooke. Rosamond begins to pay more attention to Ladislaw now. After Brooke's failed election campaign, Ladislaw decides to leave MiddleMarch. He however wishes to visit Dorothea to say goodbye. Although Dorothea is quite independent after the death of her husband, Casaubon, she is still the prisoner of his will. She falls in love with Ladislaw. Initially she had only seen Ladislaw as her husband's unfortunate relative, but now she is deeply in love with him. She renounces Casaubon's fortune and shocks her family once again by announcing that she is going to marry Ladislaw. On the other hand, Fred proves to be an apt pupil of Caleb. He finally succeeds and wins the hand of Mary. Along with three principal stories, there are glimpses of other scenes. Featherstone's greedy relatives gather for the spoils. The book ends with the description of Dorothea. She happens to have gone through upheavals in her life and now there is a kind of calm.